On a quiet tarmac, under the golden hues of a setting sun, a seasoned pilot stood tall, believing he was in control. But when he refused to acknowledge a woman boarding a private jet, he had no idea who she really was, or the power she held in silence. By the time he realized his mistake, it was too late. How will she respond to his arrogance? And what shocking fate it awaits him when her husband steps in? Stay tuned to find out. And before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more incredible stories of power, justice, and unexpected twists. The sun was beginning its descent over Los Angeles, casting long golden hues across the private airstrip. The distant hum of jet engines and the soft clatter of ground crew equipment filled the air. A sleek Gulfstream G700 sat on the tarmac, its polished surface reflecting the fading light. Everything about the scene exuded exclusivity, except for one thing: the tension brewing near the aircraft's entrance. Standing stiffly at the base of the jet's stairs was Captain Richard Hensley, his arms crossed, eyes locked on the horizon, with a thinly veiled expression of impatience. His navy blue uniform was immaculate, but the slight downturn of his mouth and the way his fingers tapped against his arm betrayed his growing irritation. "Where the hell is she?" he muttered under his breath, checking his watch. A nearby flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. "The passenger is en route, Captain. Should be here any minute," she said, her voice polite but hesitant. "Typical," Hensley scoffed. "These people never know how to be on time." The flight attendant frowned slightly, but chose not to engage. Hensley had a reputation. He was a seasoned pilot, technically skilled, but his arrogance had rubbed many the wrong way. He prided himself on recognizing new money from a mile away, and he never had much respect for it. As he adjusted his cap and sighed dramatically, the deep rumble of an approaching Cadillac Escalade broke through the ambient airfield noise. The sleek black SUV pulled up smoothly, its tinted windows concealing the passenger inside. The chauffeur stepped out, moving with precise efficiency as he opened the back door. Hensley straightened his posture slightly, but the moment Dr. Maya Brooks stepped out, his expression hardened. He already knew. This was going to be a long flight. The black Cadillac Escalade rolled to a smooth stop at the edge of the private airstrip, its engine humming softly before shutting off. The chauffeur, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, stepped out with practiced efficiency, moving to the rear passenger door. As he pulled it open, Dr. Maya Brooks emerged with a quiet grace, her heels clicking softly against the tarmac. Dressed in a cream-colored power suit, she exuded the effortless confidence of someone who was not only accustomed to luxury, but had earned her place in it. Her sleek black hair was pulled into a low, elegant bun, and a pair of dark sunglasses shielded her sharp, observant gaze. In one hand, she held a leather briefcase, the only accessory she carried aside from the presence that spoke louder than any material possession. Behind her, Julia, her assistant, hurried out of the SUV, juggling a designer travel bag and a tablet. She glanced toward the jet before leaning toward Maya. "He's already glaring at us," Julia muttered under her breath. Maya, without turning her head, simply adjusted the cuff of her blazer. "Let him," she replied coolly. At the base of the jet's stairs, Captain Richard Hensley stood rigid, watching them approach. His blue-gray eyes narrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. To him, it was obvious. This woman did not belong here. He had flown plenty of high-profile passengers, but something about her presence unsettled him. As Maya reached the stairs, she offered a poised smile, her tone smooth and professional. "Good evening, Captain." Hensley didn't move. He didn't respond. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, turning his gaze past her, as though she wasn't there at all. Julia blinked, her grip tightening on the bag she carried. "Excuse me, Captain," she said, her voice edged with polite firmness. "Dr. Brooks is ready to board." Only then did Hensley acknowledge them. His jaw tightened before he spoke. "Flight is prepped," he said curtly, his voice devoid of any warmth. Then, without another word, he turned and strode up the stairs, disappearing into the cockpit. Julia let out a short breath, shaking her head. Unbelievable. Maya, however, remained unfazed. She glanced up the stairs before turning to Julia. "You see it, don't you?" Julia hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I see it." Maya's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Good. Let's see how far he takes it." Then, with the same quiet poise, she ascended the stairs, stepping into the luxury cabin, where the real battle had only just begun. The cabin door shut, with a soft hiss, sealing in the crisp, cool air of the Gulfstream G700's luxurious interior. Inside, the space was a picture of understated elegance: white leather seats, polished mahogany accents, and soft ambient lighting that cast a warm glow over everything. A flight attendant, dressed impeccably in a tailored uniform, greeted Maya with a bright but slightly nervous smile. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Brooks. May I take your coat?" Maya handed over her coat with a gracious nod. "Thank you." She moved smoothly toward her seat, unhurried, exuding the kind of confidence that didn't need to be announced. Julia followed closely behind, her usual composure cracking under frustration. "I still can't believe that just happened," Julia muttered under her breath, setting Maya's leather briefcase on the table beside her seat. Maya simply adjusted the sleeves of her cream blazer, her expression unreadable. "Believe it," she said lightly. Across the cabin, the cockpit door clicked open. Captain Richard Hensley stepped out, his eyes sweeping the interior, before briefly landing on Maya. His gaze was sharp, almost assessing. And then, just as quickly, he dismissed her. Without a word, he turned his attention to the flight attendants instead. "Final checks need to be completed. We take off in 10 minutes, he said, his voice brisk, authoritative. The lead flight attendant nodded quickly. "Yes, Captain." Not once did he acknowledge Maya. Not a simple welcome aboard. No direct eye contact. Nothing. Julia's jaw tightened. She turned to Maya, keeping her voice low. "Did you see that?" Maya gave a barely perceptible nod. "I did." "And?" Julia pressed, arms crossed. "Are you seriously just going to let that slide?" Maya reached for the glass of sparkling water, waiting at her seat, lifting it with an elegant precision. She took a slow sip before setting it down, with an almost deliberate softness. Her dark eyes flickered toward Julia, calm yet razor-sharp. "Patience," she murmured. Julia huffed, clearly unsatisfied with that response. "Patience for what?" Maya leaned back into her seat, crossing her legs gracefully. "For people like him to reveal themselves completely." As if on cue, the intercom crackled to life, and Hensley's voice filled the cabin, flat and indifferent. "Cabin crew, prepare for takeoff." Maya didn't move. She simply folded her hands in her lap and waited. As the Gulfstream G700 smoothly taxied down the runway, the tension in the cabin was almost tangible. The flight attendants moved swiftly, ensuring everything was in place, their movements polished, but slightly stiff, as if aware of the discomfort lingering in the air. Maya remained poised in her seat, one hand resting lightly on the armrest, the other idly tracing the rim of her crystal glass of sparkling water. Beside her, Julia's fingers drummed impatiently against her tablet. "I still can't believe how rude he was," Julia whispered, leaning closer so only Maya could hear. He acted like you weren't even standing there. Maya glanced at her assistant with a faint, knowing smile. And that bothers you? Of course. It bothers me, Julia hissed under her breath. You don't deserve to be treated like that, Maya. I mean, you're... Maya raised a single elegant hand, stopping Julia mid-sentence. That, she said softly, is exactly why I'm not reacting. Julia frowned. I don't follow. Maya took a small sip of water before setting the glass down. Men like him, they thrive on reaction. Arrogance like his doesn't exist in a vacuum. It feeds on validation, on proving something to itself. If I gave him even a hint that his behavior affected me, he'd think he won. Julia huffed. Well, I'd love to show him just how wrong he is. Maya chuckled lightly, shaking her head. No need. People like him always overstep eventually. All we have to do is wait. A flight attendant approached cautiously, clearly aware of the underlying tension, but maintaining her professional smile. Dr. Brooks, can I get you anything else before takeoff? Maya gave her a warm, reassuring look. No, thank you. I'm all set. The young woman hesitated for a fraction of a second, then glanced toward the cockpit door, lowering her voice slightly. If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask. Maya didn't miss the subtle implication in her words. She had noticed everything. Maya inclined her head slightly. I appreciate that. As the attendant walked away, Julia shook her head. See, even they can tell something's off. Maya exhaled softly, eyes flickering toward the closed cockpit door. Good. That means when the time comes, there will be witnesses. Julia blinked, then let out a slow, knowing smile. You're playing chess. He doesn't even realize he's on the board. Maya simply leaned back in her seat, her expression unreadable. Exactly. Inside the cockpit, Captain Richard Hensley gripped the control yoke a little tighter than necessary, his jaw clenched as he stared at the instruments. The flight was proceeding smoothly. The Gulfstream G700, slicing through the night sky with effortless precision. But his mind was far from focused on the controls. Instead, it was fixated on Dr. Maya Brooks, the woman seated in the cabin behind him. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head, as if to clear his thoughts. She hadn't done anything. Not really. She hadn't demanded special treatment. She hadn't acted entitled. And yet, her very presence unsettled him. She thinks she owns the place, he muttered under his breath. His co-pilot, Ethan Calloway, a younger but competent pilot, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sir? Hensley let out a humorless chuckle. You don't see it, do you, Ethan? People like her. His voice dipped into something bitter. They walk into spaces they don't belong, act like they're untouchable. Ethan stiffened, eyes flicking toward the small cabin camera feed on the monitor. The live footage showed Maya sitting calmly, sipping her water, completely unbothered. Julia, her assistant, was gesturing animatedly, clearly irritated about something, but Maya, serene, collected, unshaken. Ethan turned back toward his captain, frowning slightly. With all due respect, sir, she's just sitting there. Hensley scoffed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. Exactly. That's the problem. She should have reacted by now. Should have gotten annoyed. Complained. His fingers tapped restlessly against the control panel. Instead, she's sitting there like she's above it all. Ethan hesitated, then spoke carefully. Or maybe she just doesn't care what you think. Hensley snapped his gaze toward his co-pilot, eyes flashing with irritation. Watch your tone, Calloway. Ethan held up his hands in surrender, but said nothing else. He could already tell. This was personal for Hensley, and that was dangerous. The captain exhaled, forcing himself to focus, but the resentment still simmered beneath his skin. He wouldn't let her win. Number. She needed to be reminded who was really in control. With a calculated smirk, he reached for the intercom switch, his finger hovering over the button. Let's see how calm she stays after this. A soft chime rang through the Gulfstream G700's cabin as the intercom crackled to life. Passengers are reminded to remain seated for the duration of the flight. Unexpected turbulence can be unsettling, and for safety reasons, we appreciate your cooperation. The condescension in Captain Richard Hensley's tone was unmistakable. Julia, who had been scrolling through emails on her tablet, froze mid-motion. Slowly, she turned toward Maya, her expression a mix of disbelief and outrage. Did he seriously just... Maya didn't move. She simply took a measured sip of her water, setting the glass down with deliberate care. Julia scoffed, her voice rising. That was for you. He's trying to make it seem like you're some difficult passenger, like you're a problem. The flight attendants standing at the front of the cabin exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't oblivious. They had seen pilots like Hensley before, men who wielded authority like a blunt instrument, determined to remind certain passengers exactly where they stood. Maya, however, remained impossibly calm. He's baiting me, she murmured. Julia threw up her hands. And you're just gonna let him? Maya turned, finally meeting Julia's frustrated gaze. Do you remember what I told you? Julia blinked, then sighed. People like him always overstep. A slow, knowing smile touched Maya's lips. Exactly. Meanwhile, inside the cockpit, Hensley smirked as he leaned back into his seat. He had seen it 100 times before. Passengers who thought they were untouchable, whose tempers flared the moment they were reminded they weren't in charge. She's probably fuming back there, he muttered. Ethan Calloway, his co-pilot, shifted uncomfortably. Sir, was that really necessary? Hensley scoffed. It's my plane, my rules. Ethan hesitated. Except, it's not your plane, sir. Hensley's smirk faltered slightly. Before he could respond, the control panel blinked with an incoming message. A high-priority notification flashed across the screen. Incoming message from owner's office. Priority. Immediate. Hensley's grip on the yoke tightened. His heart began to race. Ethan glanced at him, sensing the sudden tension. Sir. Hensley's eyes darted toward the screen. And just like that, his control was slipping. Captain Richard Hensley swallowed hard as he stared at the blinking message on the control panel. His fingers twitched over the controls, but his mind was elsewhere. Incoming message from owner's office. Priority. Immediate. Ethan Calloway, his co-pilot, noticed his hesitation. Sir, what does it say? Hensley didn't respond immediately. His eyes darted back to the cabin camera feed, where Dr. Maya Brooks sat, poised and composed, entirely unbothered by his little power play. She should have reacted. She should have been rattled. But she wasn't. Instead, she was waiting, watching, and that sent an uncomfortable chill down his spine. Ethan's voice cut through his thoughts again. Captain? Hensley exhaled sharply, pressing his lips into a thin line. He finally clicked on the message. Prepare for direct communication upon landing. Expect reassignment review. The words felt like a slap to the face. His breath hitched. Reassignment? That was corporate speak for termination. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, noticing the way Hensley's face had gone pale. Sir, what's going on? Hensley forced a chuckle, but it came out hollow. Nothing. Just a routine check-in. Ethan wasn't convinced, but he didn't push further. The tension in the cockpit was suffocating. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, Julia could sense something had shifted. She leaned toward Maya, whispering, "Something's happening up there." He hasn't made another announcement, and the co-pilot looks tense. Maya's lips curled into a knowing smile. Good. That means the message reached him. Julia blinked. Message? Maya simply adjusted her cuff. Michael doesn't send priority messages unless it's serious. Julia's mouth parted slightly in realization. Wait, you knew this was coming? Maya's expression remained serene. I knew he'd do it to himself. Julia exhaled, shaking her head in awe. You didn't even have to lift a finger. Maya took another sip of her water. No, Julia. Power isn't about being the loudest. It's about knowing when to let someone destroy themselves. And with that, she sat back in her seat, waiting for the inevitable. The Gulfstream G700 touched down smoothly on the private runway in New York, the landing so perfect that even Julia, who had been brimming with frustration the entire flight, had to admit Hensley was technically skilled. But skill wouldn't save him now. Outside, the black SUVs were already waiting. Their headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the tarmac like spotlights on a stage. The moment the jet slowed to a halt, uniformed personnel stepped out of the vehicles, their movements precise and deliberate. Julia's eyes widened as she peeked out the window. Maya? Maya didn't need to look. She already knew. Instead, she simply adjusted the gold bracelet on her wrist. Yes, Julia? Michael's here, and he's not alone. Maya finally turned her head toward the cabin door, just as it opened with a soft click. The air outside was crisp, the scent of jet fuel lingering in the cool night. And then, Michael Carter stepped in. He was a man who never had to raise his voice to command attention. Dressed in a charcoal gray suit, his dark eyes swept the cabin before landing on his wife. Maya gave him a soft, knowing smile. You made good time. Michael returned the smile, then turned to look at Captain Hensley, who had just stepped out of the cockpit, his usual smugness nowhere to be seen. The second Hensley locked eyes with Michael. His stomach dropped. Mr. Carter, Michael raised a hand, silencing him effortlessly. Captain Hensley, he said, his tone calm but razor-sharp. Would you care to explain your behavior on this flight? Hensley opened his mouth, searching for an excuse, but nothing came. He knew there were witnesses, the flight crew, Julia, even Ethan, his own co-pilot. Michael let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of it to settle. Then, with finality, he said, Your services are no longer required. You are dismissed, effective immediately. Hensley paled. Sir, Michael didn't blink. Security will escort you off the aircraft. Two men in suits stepped forward. Hensley's mouth opened and closed uselessly, his career crumbling around him. Julia let out a slow, satisfied exhale. Maya simply picked up her champagne glass and took a sip. Some lessons, after all, didn't need to be taught. They taught themselves. The silence in the Gulfstream G700's cabin was thick, heavier than the crisp night air outside. The tension from moments earlier still lingered, hanging over Captain Richard Hensley, like a storm cloud ready to break. He stood frozen, his mind racing for a way out, a defense, a justification, anything. Mr. Carter. Hensley tried again, his voice forced into something resembling polite desperation. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Michael Carter's expression didn't waver. He tilted his head slightly, as if observing something beneath a microscope. There's no misunderstanding, Michael said, his voice cool and even. We both know exactly what happened here. The words hit like a hammer. Hensley swallowed hard. He looked around the cabin, hoping for support, an ally, anyone. But no one met his gaze. Ethan, his co-pilot, stood near the cockpit stone-faced. The flight attendants kept their heads down. Even Julia, who had been the most openly frustrated throughout the flight, simply crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow. And then there was Dr. Maya Brooks. Seated elegantly, she hadn't said a word since Bonkel arrived. She didn't need to. Hensley exhaled sharply, his last shred of arrogance slipping away. He knew when he was beaten. Security stepped forward. "Captain, please collect your belongings." A hot wave of humiliation rushed through him. Slowly, stiffly, he turned and walked toward the cockpit for the last time. The weight of his final exit settled over the cabin. The end of a career that, just hours ago, had seemed untouchable. Julia let out a slow breath, shaking her head in disbelief. "Wow," she muttered. "I mean, just like that?" Maya finally moved, picking up her champagne glass, swirling the golden liquid slowly before taking a sip. She set it down with deliberate grace. "It was over before he even knew it," she murmured. Julia exhaled a laugh, shaking her head. "I have to admit, that was satisfying." Maya's lips curled into a faint smile. Some people fall because they're pushed. She glanced toward the cockpit door, where Hensley had disappeared. Others fall because they never learned where the edge was. With that, she leaned back into her seat, completely at ease, while outside, the once mighty captain disappeared into the night, alone. As the Gulfstream G700's engines powered down, the night air outside felt crisp, almost cleansing. The tension that had once filled the cabin had vanished, replaced by a quiet sense of finality. Michael Carter turned to his wife, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" Maya smiled, reaching for his hand briefly. "I'm perfectly fine." Julia, still processing everything, let out a slow exhale. "I swear that was the most satisfying thing I've ever witnessed." Michael smirked slightly, but Maya simply shook her head, amused. "People like him don't need to be fought," she said, adjusting the cuff of her blazer. "They do all the work themselves." Julia leaned back, shaking her head in amazement. "You didn't have to raise your voice. You didn't even have to call for help." Maya's eyes flickered with something sharp, knowing. "Power isn't about being the loudest in the room, Julia. It's about knowing when to be silent and letting people reveal themselves." Michael squeezed her hand. "And they always do." Outside, a black SUV waited, the soft glow of the city skyline stretching beyond it. Michael gestured toward the door. "Shall we?" Maya stood gracefully, gathering her things. She took one last glance around the cabin, where, just hours ago, a man had thought he was in control. Now he was gone, and yet the world kept moving, completely unfazed by his absence. As she stepped onto the tarmac, the heels of her designer shoes clicking softly against the pavement, she exhaled deeply. Some victories weren't won with shouting or force or confrontation. Some victories were simply about being unshakable and letting the rest fall apart on its own. The story of Dr. Maya Brooks teaches a powerful lesson about grace, patience, and the true nature of power. In life, we will all encounter people like Captain Richard Hensley, those who underestimate, disrespect, or dismiss us based on their own biases. The key takeaway: power isn't about reacting to every slight or proving yourself to those who refuse to see your worth. It's about knowing when to act and when to let others expose their own flaws. Maya didn't demand respect. She commanded it through her composure. Instead of engaging in an argument, she allowed Hensley's arrogance to be his own downfall. This is a lesson in emotional intelligence, the ability to stay calm under pressure, to recognize when someone is trying to bait you, and to understand that true power lies in self-control, not in retaliation. In professional and personal life, it's easy to be tempted by immediate confrontation, but the smartest move is often strategic patience. Let people reveal who they are, and when the time comes, let consequences speak louder than words. Remember, the most powerful person in the room isn't always the loudest. It's the one who remains unshaken. If this were you, which approach would you take? 1. Stay composed and let people reveal their own downfall, just like Maya did. 2. Confront them immediately to defend yourself, making sure they know their behavior is unacceptable. Drop a 1 or 2 in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so we can share more powerful stories like this together.